The border town always looked peaceful from a distance, but the people who lived there knew that peace could change quickly. The land stretched far in every direction, with dry hills, open fields, and long quiet roads that seemed to disappear into the horizon. The empire often spoke proudly about its strength, but this border region relied more on its own people than on anyone sitting far away in a clean, warm office dot every evening. The patrol teams walked the old road that led toward the frontier. They carried basic gear, nothing fancy, and they usually joked with each other to pass the time. But over the past few weeks, their tone had changed. The laughter had faded. The road felt different. It felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a person feel watched. One evening, as orange light fell over the hills, one of the patrol workers spotted something unusual. It was a strange metallic glint near a distant ridge, a place where no one normally traveled. At first, he thought it might be a reflection from a piece of broken equipment, but then he noticed movement. It was slow, like someone or something trying not to be seen. He stopped walking, stared for a long moment, and felt a heavy worry settle in his chest. He walked back faster than usual, reaching the main outpost where the officer in charge worked. The officer, known by everyone for staying calm during problems, listened carefully. He didn't interrupt or brush anything aside. He just nodded, asked questions, and took notes. His expression grew serious as the worker explained the strange movement. That night, the officer stayed in the small office longer than normal. He looked through old maps, checked the patrol logs, and compared the recent reports. There had been other small incidents: 2 footprints found near the fence, a missing shipment, a broken sensor. Alone, each issue looked small, almost meaningless, but together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. He prepared a formal warning for the Empire's command center. He wrote clearly, explaining the unusual activity and advising the Empire to send observations, or at least a small reinforcement team. He didn't ask for much. He just wanted someone higher up to take the matter seriously. The next morning, his message traveled through the long communication chain that connected the border to the capital. Workers on the far end stamped the document, passed it forward, and stacked it into a pile with many other requests. In the capital, nothing looked urgent. People walked through shiny halls with polished floors, not even aware of the dust-filled wind blowing across the border towns. To them, the frontier was just a distant dot on a large map. Hours later, the officer received a short reply. The message didn't show any concern. They simply said the situation sounded minor and that they would review it later. He read the message twice, feeling disappointment settle in his stomach. He had seen enough in his years at the border to know when something was not right. This wasn't a normal situation, and ignoring it was dangerous. But he didn't argue. He knew the Empire rarely changed its mind unless something truly dramatic happened. Instead, he told the patrol teams to stay alert. He didn't want them frightened, but he wanted them prepared. They trusted him, so they followed his advice without question. Over the next few days, more strange signs appeared. At night, shadows seemed to move along the distant road. The winds carried faint metallic sounds that didn't belong to nature. The people in the small town noticed the change too. Children stopped playing near the perimeter. Shopkeepers closed earlier than usual. Even the stray dogs stayed close to the buildings instead of wandering near the fields. One evening, 2 patrol workers returned with tense expressions. They had found unusual tire tracks near an area where no vehicles were allowed. The tracks were deep and fresh. The officer went with them to see for himself. He ran his hand along the ground, feeling how sharply the dirt had been pressed down. Whoever had traveled through there was carrying heavy equipment. He sent another message to the Empire, this one more detailed. He added sketches of the tracks, descriptions of the movement, and a clear warning that someone or something was gathering near the border. He waited for a reply, hoping this time they would listen. But the Empire's answer came the same way as before, calm, slow, dismissive. They thanked him for the update, but said there was no evidence of a threat. They encouraged him to maintain routine operations. That phrase angered him more than anything else. Routine operations were not enough anymore. He could feel danger approaching the way a person feels a storm before it arrives. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he walked along the border fence, listening to the wind and watching the distant hills. The moon was bright enough for him to see the outline of the ridge from earlier. He stood there for a long time, feeling something difficult to explain something between fear and certainty. The next morning, he gathered his team. He spoke simply, telling them what he suspected without causing panic. They respected him because he never exaggerated anything. If he said something was wrong, they believed him. They adjusted their shifts, tightened the patrol routes, and checked their equipment more carefully. The officer also visited the town elders. They were old, wise people who had lived by the border long before the Empire took full control. When he explained the situation, they exchanged uneasy glances. One of them said quietly that long periods of silence usually meant someone was planning something. Another said the animals in the area had been acting strangely, moving away from the hills unexpectedly. Their words strengthened the officer's resolve. He walked back to the outpost with heavy thoughts. He wanted to do more, but his authority was limited. He could protect the town, but he could not force the Empire to act unless he had undeniable proof. Over the next 2 days, the town felt more tense than ever. Even the air seemed heavier. People walked faster, spoke less, and kept glancing toward the horizon. The market was quieter, the schools emptier. The officer continued reviewing reports, updating patrol routes, and encouraging everyone to stay sharp. On the third evening, he received another small report that made his heart race. A scout had seen faint lights flashing in a pattern near the ridge after sunset lights that looked like signals. That was enough for the officer. He didn't wait. He wrote a final urgent message to the Empire, explaining that hostile activity was almost certain. He marked the message as high priority and sent it immediately. He waited by the radio for hours, hoping this time the capital would wake up and understand the danger. But no message came. The silence from the Empire felt louder than the shifting winds. Later that night, the officer stepped outside and looked at the stars. The border stretched into darkness, and the town behind him slept uneasily. He wondered how many warnings an Empire needed before it finally acted. He breathed deeply, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. He knew something was coming. He didn't know when, but he could sense it. And he knew that when it came, the border town would stand alone until help arrived, if help arrived at all. That thought stayed with him as he returned to his desk, sat down, and began preparing for the worst. He didn't want fear to spread, but he wanted readiness. He trained his mind to focus, telling himself that small warnings were often the most important ones. Some people ignored them. He could not. He stayed awake until dawn, watching the sky lighten through the office window. He didn't know what the next days would bring, but he was certain of one thing. The Empire had ignored the border warning, and whatever was approaching would test everyone in ways they had never imagined. The next few days at the border town felt strangely heavy, as if time itself had slowed down, and everyone was waiting for something they couldn't describe. People tried to go about their daily routines, but the uneasiness kept pulling at their thoughts. Even small sounds, like the creaking of old doors or the cry of a distant bird, made people look around nervously. The officer at the outpost had barely slept since the night he sent his last message to the Empire. He kept walking back and forth across the small office, checking updates, rereading patrol logs, and watching the communication radio like it might suddenly wake up with an urgent reply. But nothing happened. The radio remained silent, as if the Empire was on another planet instead of the same land. He didn't want his tiredness to show. So every morning he splashed cold water on his face and straightened his uniform before meeting his team. He wanted them to feel confident, not worried because their leader looked worn down. The team trusted him, and he didn't want to break that trust. Early one morning, 2 patrol workers came in looking tense. They reported that the strange signs at the border had not only continued, but had grown more obvious. They described unusual footprints near the fence, not human, not animal, but something heavy, like someone dragging equipment with wide wheels. They also mentioned hearing a faint humming sound during the night, a sound with no clear source. The officer took notes and thanked them. He walked out with them to the edge of the town and checked the area himself. He bent down, touched the marks in the dirt, and followed them a few meters. He could tell they weren't random. Whoever made them was moving with purpose. As he studied the ground, he felt a prickle of fear on the back of his neck. Not panic, not alarm, just a cold reminder that something serious was coming closer. He stood up, looked toward the hills, and stayed silent for a moment. He returned to the outpost and drafted another warning report. He didn't hide anything. He explained the growing signs, the strange patterns, and the risk of ignoring them. This time he didn't try to sound calm. He allowed the urgency to show through his words. He sent the message with a special priority marker, hoping someone in the Empire's command center would read it immediately. Hours passed. People moved in and out of the outpost. Paperwork piled up. Patrol teams checked in with updates. But the radio stayed quiet. Not a single reply. The officer stared at the device, wondering if the Empire thought the border was too far away to matter. By late afternoon, he sighed deeply. He couldn't depend on the Empire's response anymore. He needed to stay focused on what he could control. He called his team together. They gathered around him in a small room, some still holding tools, others wiping sweat from their faces after long patrols. He spoke honestly, telling them the situation had changed. He said they might be facing something big, something they didn't fully understand yet, and they needed to prepare. He reminded them to check their equipment twice, to move in pairs, and to report even the smallest detail. They agreed without argument. Their faces showed worry, but also determination. They trusted him more than they trusted the Empire. Later, he walked through the town to check on the people. He visited the small market, where shopkeepers stood behind their stalls, but kept looking toward the border. One shop owner quietly told him her customers had started buying more food than usual, not because of a festival or event, but because they had a feeling something was wrong. He didn't want to scare them, so he told her everything was under control. But she looked into his eyes, and she could tell he was hiding something. Still, she didn't press him. People in the border town respected silence, sometimes more than answers. As he walked away, he noticed the school's playground was empty. Children usually ran around until sunset, shouting and laughing, but today the area looked abandoned. Even the stray cats stayed close to doorways instead of wandering freely. A group of elders sat near a small building, discussing something in low voices. When the officer passed by, they nodded respectfully. One of them said, "The land is restless." Another added softly, "When the signs grow louder, danger is not far behind." Their words echoed in his mind as he made his way back to the outpost. That evening, just as the sky turned dark blue, a patrol team rushed in with worried expressions. They had seen lights again, this time brighter and moving in a clear pattern. Not random flickers, not reflections, but signals. Real signals. The officer hurried to the observation point with them. They crouched low behind a rocky area and looked toward the ridge. For a moment, everything seemed silent. Then one of the patrol workers pointed. In the distance, Tiny points of light blinked in a repeated rhythm. They flickered in a sequence that looked deliberate, like someone sending coded messages. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The meaning was obvious. No group would risk using lights that bright unless they were preparing for something big. Very big. He rushed back to the outpost and wrote another urgent message, this one more forceful than the last. He explained that there was no longer any doubt. Someone was gathering near the border with organized movements. He requested reinforcement immediately, not next week or tomorrow, but now. He pressed the send button and waited, heart pounding with frustration. He wanted to believe the Empire would take this warning seriously. But again, there was silence. A long, heavy silence that felt like a thick wall he couldn't break through. The officer leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He was angry, not because he feared for himself, but because he feared for the people in the town. They were innocent, hard-working people who expected the Empire to protect them. And the Empire was failing them. He stood up again, unable to sit still. He walked outside and looked toward the dark land stretching in front of him. The wind blew softly, carrying scents of dust and dry grass. In the distance, he thought he saw another faint glow, but it disappeared quickly. He breathed deeply and told himself he had to stay sharp. He had to keep his people safe with or without help. The next day, more reports arrived. A group of workers had heard engines at night, heavy engines that didn't match any local vehicle. A farmer said he found a piece of metal in the field, something that looked like part of a machine, but from no machine he recognized. Another patrol team reported seeing dust clouds rising from behind the hills, as if something large was moving. The officer collected all these reports and studied them. He placed them in order, looking for patterns. It was clear. Someone was advancing, slowly but surely, toward the border. He felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. He was scared for the town, but he knew he could not allow panic. He had to keep everyone steady. He spent the whole afternoon talking to people, walking through the market, checking the roads, and making sure patrol teams stayed alert. He tried to calm people down without lying to them. He didn't want false promises. He just wanted them prepared. By evening, the town felt even more tense. Parents kept their children indoors. Lanterns were lit earlier than usual. People avoided talking loudly, as if raising their voices might attract attention from the darkness beyond the hills. The officer stood at the border fence again, staring into the night. He could hear the distant hum, so faint that he wondered if it was his imagination. But he knew it wasn't. He had learned to trust his instincts. He felt a sharp awareness settle over him. The signs were no longer small. They were large, clear, and impossible to ignore. He whispered to himself, "They're coming." And as the wind blew across the dark fields, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Empire might still be ignoring the warnings, but the danger was now close enough that no one could pretend otherwise. The next days would decide everything for the border, the town, and the people who depended on him to stand firm. He walked back toward the outpost with a firm decision in his heart. If the Empire refused to take the warning seriously, then he would. He didn't know what the approaching force wanted or when they would strike, but he knew he had to prepare for whatever came next. Even if he had to face it with only the people beside him, the signs were too large now to ignore. Something was coming, and the town would have to stand strong until the truth finally revealed itself. The night everything changed began like any other, but the officer felt something different the moment the sun went down. The air felt colder than usual, and the silence carried a strange weight. Even the insects that normally buzzed around the border fence were quiet, as if they sensed danger moving in the dark. He stood outside the outpost for a long time, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the hills. He had learned to trust the land. The land never lied. It always showed early signs before anything big happened. And tonight, the land felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Inside the outpost, a small team sat near the radio and checked their notes. They spoke in low voices, each of them alert. Nobody wanted to admit they were scared, but their faces showed enough. They weren't afraid of the night itself. They were afraid of the unknown. Hidden on the other side of the hills, just after midnight, a patrol team returned from their route. They entered quickly and called for the officer. Their expressions were pale and tight. "We heard something," one of them said quietly. The officer listened closely. They described a strange rumbling sound, deep, heavy, and steady. Not like thunder, not like wind, not like any machine used in the town. It came from beyond the ridge, growing louder for a few seconds before fading into the night. The officer didn't waste time. He grabbed a lantern and signaled for the team to follow him. They moved silently through the dry grass, heading toward an elevated point where they could see the ridge clearly. The moon hung low, lighting the ground just enough for them to walk without stumbling. As they reached the hilltop, the officer raised his hand, telling everyone to stay low. They all crouched behind a cluster of rocks. For a moment, there was nothing. Only darkness, stretching far into the distance. Then it happened. A faint glow appeared behind the ridge. It flickered, disappeared, and then grew brighter. Not like a campfire, not like a flashlight. This light was bigger, wider, like a moving beam. The officer's heart tightened. He had seen similar lights many years ago, during a dangerous event along another border. That time, the threat had been real. And this looked even more organized. The light rose slightly and traveled across the ridge. A moment later, the ground beneath them trembled softly, just enough for them to feel it through their boots. One of the patrol workers whispered, "What is that?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't know for sure, but every part of him said it was trouble. The glow vanished suddenly, swallowed by darkness. But the silence afterward felt even more dangerous than the lights. The officer decided they needed to leave. They moved back toward the outpost quickly, but carefully, not wanting to attract attention. When they arrived, he immediately went to the communication room. He grabbed the radio and tried to contact the Empire again. His message was short but urgent. He reported the lights, the shaking ground, and the sounds from earlier. He told them the threat was no longer a possibility. It was happening now. He spoke clearly, hoping someone on the other end would finally understand the seriousness of the situation. But minutes passed. Then half an hour. Then almost an hour. No reply. The officer leaned over the table, gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. He felt anger, frustration, and fear all at once. The Empire had ignored every warning, and now the border town would pay the price. He forced himself to breathe slowly. He couldn't afford to break down. People depended on him. He called his team together. As they gathered, he explained what they had seen. The lights, the movement, the trembling ground. Their eyes widened, but nobody panicked. Instead, they nodded, ready to act. The officer told them to wake everyone in the town who needed to be prepared. Families living near the perimeter had to move deeper inside the town. The school building, which was sturdy and centrally located, would serve as a temporary shelter. Lights would be kept dim. People would gather quietly. 2 workers rushed to alert the town. Others checked the emergency kits and reinforced weak spots in the fence. The officer checked each piece of equipment: flashlights, spare batteries, signal flares, and old radios that might still work even if the main one failed. Within an hour, the town began shifting into a silent, organized motion. Children were gently woken and carried by their parents. Neighbors helped the elderly walk toward the school building. Shopkeepers grabbed essential supplies before locking their doors. Even the stray dogs followed the crowd. Sensing the tension, the officer moved through the town, guiding people, checking every corner, reassuring those who looked scared. He knew he couldn't promise them safety, but he could at least make them feel protected. By the time the town was gathered safely, the sky was darker than before. A cold wind swept through the streets, making the lantern flames flicker. One worker came running. "Sir, you need to see this." The officer followed him to the edge of the border fence. The worker pointed toward the ridge. At first, the officer saw nothing. But then he squinted. A pale shape moved along the hillside. Then another, and another. Dozens of silhouettes, barely visible but unmistakably real, moved in a slow, organized formation. His breath caught. They were getting closer. The silhouettes paused, then spread out along the ridge. Moments later, a sharp metallic sound echoed through the valley. It was a clank, like metal hitting metal, followed by a low, steady hum. The officer felt the vibration beneath his feet stronger this time. He whispered, "It's starting." The unknown force at the ridge moved again. The silhouettes shifted, stepping into a formation that looked too structured to be anything random. Then, suddenly, a bright beam shot upward into the sky from somewhere behind the ridge. It was not pointed toward the town. It was pointed straight up. Like a signal, the officer felt cold sweat on his back. Whatever was coming wasn't hiding anymore. The border town was facing something real, something powerful, something that had been preparing quietly while the Empire slept. Comfortably far away, the officer ordered his team to fall back. They had seen enough. They needed to protect the town, not stand exposed in the open. As they returned to the school building, people looked at their faces and knew the situation was serious. Mothers held their children closer. Older men stood near the entrance, ready to help however they could. Young workers gathered around the officer, waiting for instructions. He spoke clearly, keeping his tone steady. He told them that unknown forces were gathering, but that they had time if they stayed organized. He reminded them that fear only weakened a person, while calm thinking kept them alive. His words helped. Even though worry still filled the room, people sat quietly, their eyes watching him, trusting him. Outside, the night pulsed with strange sounds engines, distant clanks, and the soft rumble of machines moving through the hills. The officer stayed by the doorway, watching the dark horizon without blinking. He knew something big was coming. He didn't know when, but he could feel the danger drawing closer by the minute. And even though the Empire had ignored every warning, he refused to abandon his people. He stood there like a silent shield, knowing that when the next moment arrived, he would face it head on. With or without support, the night stretched long and heavy, and the border town waited. Waiting for the moment when the ridge would reveal the truth hiding behind it. At a moment when the border has already faced a long and frightening night, and the officer who stayed awake through every sound was now waiting for support that still had not arrived. The early morning light was weak, almost shy, as if even the sun was unsure about shining over a shaken town. The officer stood near the half-broken lookout tower, rubbing tired eyes, trying to stay focused. He had not slept at all. His voice was rough from shouting instructions all night, and his legs felt heavy, but he refused to leave his position. He knew many people were still depending on him. Some families had spent the night hiding in narrow rooms behind the old warehouse, while others had taken shelter behind the transport trucks parked near the tiny station. Children were half awake, whispering to each other, asking when the Empire's help would arrive. The officer wished he had an answer for them, but he kept his silence. He knew hope was important, and even if he did not have clear information, he wanted everyone to believe that help was on the way. Around that time, back in the capital, a communication worker finally picked up the officer's emergency message. She was sorting through long queues of reports that were marked urgent, but most turned out to be routine issues. When she read the officer's message, her eyes widened. She read it twice again to make sure it was not a mistake. The message was time-stamped many hours ago. She quickly rushed to her senior officer, trying her best to stay calm. The senior officer took the device, scanned the lines, and his face changed immediately. He realized this was not a normal report. He called the central command room with a trembling voice, requesting immediate attention. In minutes, higher officials gathered inside the command center, reading the message on a large display. One of them leaned forward and whispered that the border might already be in serious danger. The commander asked why this message had not been responded to earlier. No one had a clear answer. Some said the system was overloaded. Some said the signal had been delayed because of weather issues, and some simply stayed silent. But all of them felt the weight of their mistake. The air in the room was thick with tension. They had ignored the warning for too long, and now the consequences were unfolding. As they prepared a quick response, the commander ordered 2 units to move toward the border immediately. These units gathered their equipment in record time, checking vehicles, loading supplies, and preparing communications gear. A pilot standing near the transport craft asked if this was truly an emergency, and the commander replied that they had already lost precious hours. The pilot nodded with a serious look and hurried into the cockpit. While all of this movement finally began in the capital, the officer at the border still had no clue that help was finally on the way. He stood near a half-broken fence, watching smoke rise from a small storage shed farther away. It had caught fire during the night, though the flames had thankfully been contained. He walked toward a group of civilians who were discussing where they could move their families if the attackers returned. The officer tried to keep the tone steady when he told them they were safe for now, but his own voice betrayed the strain he felt. A young man asked him why the Empire had not sent help yet. The officer paused for a long moment before saying that sometimes support takes time to arrive, but he was certain the capital knew something was wrong. Deep inside, he hoped that statement would become true soon. Another woman walked close and placed her hand on his shoulder, telling him that he had already done more than anyone could have asked for. Her words gave him a small moment of comfort. He moved back to his post after checking on everyone. The wind had started to pick up, carrying the smell of burnt wood and dirt. It made the whole place feel more abandoned than usual. He kept scanning the horizon with binoculars, hoping to catch sight of the Empire's vehicles, but all he saw were dark hills and empty road stretches. An hour later, faint engine noises finally reached his ears. At first he thought he was imagining it because of exhaustion, but the sound grew louder. He signaled the others to stay calm but alert. Slowly, shapes of several large vehicles emerged from beyond a curve, moving fast along the dusty road. The officer's heart felt lighter. For the first time since the night began, he sensed real relief. The vehicles stopped near the main checkpoint. Soldiers in heavy protective gear stepped out quickly, looking around with confusion and shock. Many of them had expected a normal border inspection, but what they saw was a place that clearly had gone through a night of fear. Broken fences, damaged walls, smoke marks, and civilians standing in groups. Nothing looked normal. The commander of the unit walked straight to the officer, asking for a full update. The officer explained everything that had happened, speaking slowly but clearly. He described the sounds they had heard, the movement in the darkness, the unknown vehicles that had crossed the hills, and how he had tried contacting the capital repeatedly. The unit commander listened carefully, shaking his head at several moments as if unable to believe how such a major warning had gone unanswered. When the officer finished, the commander apologized on behalf of the Empire. He said it was unacceptable that such a delay had happened. The officer did not respond harshly. He simply nodded. Right now, he was too tired to think about blame. He was only relieved that support had arrived before the situation became worse. As the soldiers inspected the damaged areas, more support vehicles approached. Medical workers came out and started checking civilians for injuries. Some children cried in relief when they saw food packets and emergency blankets being handed out. People who had kept their fear inside all night finally allowed themselves to relax. Still, even though help had arrived, the officer knew the real questions would only begin now. Why had the warning been ignored? Who were the attackers? How had they managed to move so close without the Empire detecting them? And what did they want? Investigators sent from the capital stepped out later in the afternoon. They wore simple uniforms and carried small recording devices. They spoke politely to the officer and asked him for every detail again. Even though he was tired, he answered patiently. They also spoke to civilians, checking what they had heard or seen. One elderly man mentioned strange lights days before the attack. Another said she had seen new tracks on the dirt road near the hills. With every answer, the investigators realized how many early signs had existed. If the Empire had paid attention earlier, all of this damage might have been prevented. The officer did not say this aloud, but his eyes reflected the same thought. He just hoped the Empire would learn from this mistake. Near sunset, a small ceremony took place. It was not formal, and there were no decorations, but the commander gathered his team and the civilians to acknowledge the officer's courage. The commander said the officer had done the work of an entire unit alone. He said if the officer had not acted quickly and kept people safe, the damage would have been far worse. The civilians cheered softly, some clapping, some nodding with grateful eyes. The officer felt embarrassed by the attention, but he was also touched by their appreciation. When night approached again, the atmosphere of the border had changed. There were lights, soldiers, and equipment everywhere. The place no longer felt abandoned. The officer walked through the busy area slowly, watching everyone work to secure the surroundings. For the first time in many hours, he felt safe enough to sit down. He sat on a wooden crate and let out a deep breath he had been holding since the previous night. He looked around at the faces of families being guided toward temporary shelters. He saw soldiers carrying supplies. He saw investigators setting up their equipment. And he thought about how all this activity should have happened earlier. Still, he was grateful it finally had done. As the sky darkened, he leaned back, staring at the stars. He wondered what lessons the Empire would take from this, and whether they would change their approach in the future. He hoped so, because small warnings, if ignored, could lead to nights like the one they had just survived. And he knew not every border had someone watching as closely as he had. With these thoughts, he allowed his tired eyes to close for the first time in almost 2 days. He knew the work was far from over, but he also knew he had done everything he could. And sometimes that had to be enough. Hours after the reinforcements arrived, the border area, which had seemed almost abandoned the previous day, was now full of activity. Soldiers walked in different directions, investigators carried small devices, and medical workers kept checking people who still looked shaken. The officer who had stayed awake through the entire night stood near the main road, watching everything quietly. His body was tired, but his mind stayed alert. He knew the investigation that was about to begin would reveal things no one had expected. As the morning sun rose, the investigators approached the officer again and asked him if he could guide them through the exact places where the unknown group had entered. The officer agreed and began walking with them toward the damaged sections of the fence. Along the way, he explained that he had heard unfamiliar engines and had seen shadows moving quickly across the hills. He pointed at areas where he had found footprints and tire marks. The investigators took pictures and collected samples of the tracks. One of them knelt on the ground and picked up a small piece of metal. It looked like a broken part of a machine, maybe from one of the unknown vehicles. He held it up and said it didn't match any known equipment used by the Empire or the nearby regions. Another investigator checked the direction the tracks were heading and whispered that whoever came here had a clear goal. The officer followed their movements closely. He wanted to understand the truth just as much as they did. For days, he had noticed strange signs, unusual lights, missing supply crates, and strange paths in the dirt. But he had never imagined a group large enough and bold enough to approach the border directly. At the same time, civilians gathered near the temporary shelter area. They talked among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. Many of them had their own theories. Some thought it was a group of smugglers. Others believed it was a rival faction trying to test the Empire's strength. But most of them simply wanted to know why no one had listened earlier. They wondered how early warnings had been ignored for so long. Later in the day, the investigators returned to their transport vehicle to analyze the information they had gathered. The officer waited outside, leaning against a wall, watching soldiers repair the fence and install new lights. He overheard one soldier saying that the Empire was embarrassed by how slow their response had been. Another soldier replied that the officer had saved the whole border on his own. The officer pretended not to hear them, but their words made him feel both proud and uneasy. When the investigators finally stepped out of their vehicle, they looked more serious than before. They asked the officer to walk with them to a quieter corner. There, they explained what they had discovered. They believed the attackers were part of a large organized group operating from deep within the hills. This group had been studying the Empire for months, maybe longer. They were looking for a weak point where they could enter without facing strong resistance. One investigator said the most surprising part: this group had been watching the border closely, observing every patrol, every change in routine, and every gap in surveillance. They knew exactly when to strike. The officer felt a chill run down his spine. He realized that the strange signs he had reported earlier were not random. They were warning signs that the group was testing the border's defenses. Investigators went on to say that the Empire's failure to act quickly had made the attack easier for the intruders. If the warning had been taken seriously, the Empire could have strengthened the border earlier. The officer felt the weight of those words, not because he was guilty, but because he knew he had done everything he could. It was the system, not the people on the ground, that had failed. Later, the capital sent a small team of analysts who began interviewing every witness. They spoke to the officer several times, asking him to repeat every detail. Some might have found this process exhausting, but the officer understood its importance. He shared everything he remembered, the exact sounds he heard, the times he sent messages, the way the intruders moved, and the fear he saw in the civilians' eyes. The analysts listened carefully, recording everything. Meanwhile, soldiers continued searching the hills in small groups. They found abandoned equipment, traces of cooking fires, and hidden pathways that suggested the intruders had prepared their base weeks earlier. They even found containers used for storing food and water, proving the group was planning a long-term operation. Each discovery made the situation more alarming. It showed how deeply the intruders had studied the border and how much they had prepared. One evening, the officer sat with a group of civilians near the shelter. A young woman asked him if the Empire would finally take border safety seriously after this incident. The officer replied that he believed things would change. She looked at him with hopeful eyes and said she trusted his judgment. Another older man nodded and said the officer had become a symbol of strength for the whole town. The officer felt humbled by their words. He had not done anything for praise. He had simply followed his duty, even when the Empire didn't respond. But hearing their gratitude made him realize how much people valued dedication, especially during danger. The next morning, the investigators called for a general meeting. They gathered the officer, the soldiers, and the civilians near the repaired fence. Everyone waited quietly, wondering what the investigators were going to say. After a moment, One of them stepped forward and addressed the group. He explained that they had gathered enough evidence to understand the motive behind the attack. The intruders were trying to gain access to a secret mineral route that lay deep underground, just beyond the border. This route held valuable resources that the Empire relied on for energy and trade. If the intruders had gained full access, they could have weakened the Empire financially and strategically. The civilians gasped softly. Many of them had never known such a route existed. The officer felt a mixture of anger and shock. He realized that this border town, which seemed simple and quiet, was actually guarding something far more important than anyone had expected. The investigator continued speaking, saying that the Empire's misjudgment had almost allowed a major disaster. But he also said the officer's courage and quick decisions had stopped the intruders from reaching their goal. Because the officer kept the civilians safe and slowed down the attackers, reinforcements had arrived in time to secure the area. When the investigator finished, everyone turned toward the officer. Many clapped, some raised their hands in respect, and a few simply smiled with gratitude. The officer nodded politely, feeling emotional but keeping his expression calm. After the meeting, the officer walked away to clear his thoughts. He felt proud of what he had done, but he also felt a deep responsibility. He knew the Empire would rebuild, strengthen its defenses, and improve its response systems. But he also knew that the border would always need careful eyes and steady hands. And he hoped that the next time someone sent a warning, the Empire would listen immediately. As the week continued, fences were repaired, new cameras were installed, and soldiers began new patrol rotations. The civilians slowly began to return to their normal routines. Children played near the shelters, merchants reopened their small shops, and the town started to breathe again. One evening, as the officer stood at the top of the lookout tower, he watched the sky turn orange. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. The danger had passed, but the lesson would remain forever. Ignoring a small sign could open the door to a big disaster. But listening, truly listening, could protect an entire town. And as he looked across the hills, he silently promised himself that he would stay alert every single day. No matter what happened, he would never let another warning go unheard. The morning after the attack felt nothing like a normal morning. The sun rose slowly over the hills, lighting the damaged border town with a tired, pale glow. Smoke still drifted from broken structures. Pieces of metal and wood lay scattered across the ground. People moved carefully, stepping around debris, speaking only when necessary. It was the kind of silence that came after a long night of fear, shouting, and survival. The officer walked slowly through the town, his boots crunching over shattered glass and dry leaves. His whole body felt heavy. He hadn't slept at all. He wasn't sure anyone in the town had slept. The danger had finally passed, but the shock was still strong. Every person he passed gave him a small nod. Some gave him a tight smile. Others simply looked at him with tired eyes full of gratitude. He nodded back each time, hiding the exhaustion that pulled at him like a weight. He remembered the moment the Empire's reinforcements had finally appeared. Hours after the attack had already torn through the border. Large vehicles rolled in. Soldiers rushed out, and medics scattered to help the wounded. But the officer had been standing there with his team long before they arrived, guiding families, calming frightened children, and keeping everyone together. Now, as the Empire's workers moved around the town, marking damaged areas, the officer felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief because people were safe. Frustration because the Empire had waited so long to respond. If they hadn't ignored the first warnings, the town would not look like this. Still, the officer knew that focusing on anger wouldn't help anyone now. People needed direction, reassurance, and steady steps toward recovery. So he pushed aside his emotions and continued checking on everyone. Near the school building, which had served as the main shelter, several families sat on blankets laid on the ground. Children rested with their heads on their parents' laps, finally drifting into real sleep after a night of fear. The officer stopped nearby to talk to the elders who were keeping watch over them. They spoke quietly about rebuilding homes, repairing the market, and restoring the fence. One of the elders said softly, "We survived because of your guidance. The Empire came late, but you stood with us from the beginning." The officer felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who simply refused to abandon others. But hearing those words made him realize how deeply people depended on him. He thanked the elder, then walked further toward the border fence. The damage there was the worst. Large parts of the metal barrier had been bent or torn away. Deep tracks from heavy machines marked the soil. Tools, scraps, and broken pieces of unknown equipment lay scattered across the area. Empire engineers were already studying the scene, taking notes, measuring the ground, and discussing what had happened. When they noticed the officer approaching, one of them nodded respectfully. "We've never seen equipment like this before," the engineer said. "Whoever attacked the border was prepared. They had strong machines, strong coordination, and a clear plan." The officer wasn't surprised. He had seen the signs long before anyone else. What bothered him wasn't the strength of the attackers, was the weakness of the Empire's response. Another engineer approached and said, "Your reports were detailed. You saw this coming." The officer didn't say much. Instead, he looked toward the ridge where the lights had appeared days earlier. Now, in the morning light, the ridge looked calm and still. No sign of movement, no sign of danger. Just quiet hills watching over a shaken town. A soldier from the Empire walked up to the officer. He carried a small notebook filled with questions. He explained that the Empire wanted to gather full details about the events leading to the attack. They needed an official statement. They needed a timeline. They needed every detail the officer had noticed. The officer spoke with him for a long time. He explained the first signs, the warnings he sent, the strange patterns of movement, the lights, the sounds, and the growing tension. He didn't hide anything. He didn't exaggerate anything. He told the truth exactly as it happened. The soldier wrote everything down carefully. When he finished, he looked at the officer with a hint of regret. If the command center had acted sooner, the soldier said, maybe things wouldn't have reached this point. The officer didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The truth was clear without repeating it. Later, Empire officials gathered in a temporary tent set up in the middle of the town. They met with local leaders, discussed what they had learned, and made decisions about strengthening the border. The officer sat in the corner, listening quietly. They talked about installing new alert systems, adding more patrols, and creating faster emergency communication lines. They spoke about improving training so no warning would ever be ignored again. For the first time, the Empire truly understood the cost of waiting too long. When the meeting ended, one of the officials approached the officer. He spoke politely, thanking him for his leadership and telling him that the Empire wished to honor him for his service. But the officer shook his head gently. "I didn't do anything for praise," he said. "I only did what anyone in my place should do." The official smiled. "That is exactly why people respect you." Later that afternoon, as the sun climbed higher, people began cleaning the town. Children started helping adults pick up debris. Neighbors worked together to fix small things, broken windows, fallen fences, scattered tools. There was a feeling of unity, a quiet strength that had grown from surviving something so dangerous together. The officer walked among them, offering help where needed. He lifted heavy planks, carried tools, and comforted those who still looked shaken. He felt proud seeing how strongly the town stood together. But deep inside, he also felt a worry. The attackers had withdrawn, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't come back. He knew the border had to be watched more closely than ever. Before Dot, as evening approached, the sky turned golden, and the noise of rebuilding slowly faded. People gathered around the central area to eat simple meals, share stories of the night, and remind each other they weren't alone. The officer sat with a group of workers, listening quietly as they talked about the future. They spoke about rebuilding homes better than before, strengthening the community, and teaching the younger generation how to stay alert. Their words brought a sense of hope to the tired evening. After the meal, the officer stood and walked alone toward the edge of the border. The land was quiet again. The wind brushed against the dry grass. The fence, though damaged, still stood as a reminder of what they had faced. He placed his hand on one of the metal posts and took a long breath. The border had changed. The town had changed. He himself had changed. What happened would never be forgotten. It would become a lesson, one that would be told for many years to come. A lesson about warning signs, about responsibility, about courage, and about how slow decisions from faraway leaders could cost innocent lives. But it was also a lesson about unity. The town had survived because they stood together. They looked out for one another. They didn't run or hide. They protected each other with everything they had. The officer looked up at the ridge one last time before turning back toward the town. The stars were beginning to appear in the night sky, shining softly above the hills. Dot. He walked slowly, knowing his work wasn't finished. The Empire would improve its systems. The border would be repaired. Life would return to normal eventually. But he would continue to watch the land, listen to the wind, and follow the signs, because he knew better than anyone what could happen when a warning is ignored. Dot, and the town trusted him completely. He wouldn't let them down.